Hi everyone. My name is Mihir Wanchoo, and welcome to Fantasy Book Critics Authors and Their Favorite Books video podcast series. And joining me today is a very special author. Her name is Tinsley. She has been a SPFPO finalist. She has been a debutante with her grimdark book, We Men of Ash and Shadow, and the most recent book, The Hand That Crux. That always slips out for me. The hand that cast the bone. I do have a question about those titles for you, Holly, later on. But joining me today is Holly Tinsley. So welcome, Holly. How have you been?
I'm good. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. I'm not going to lie, I'm very nervous, but I'm very excited to be here.
Well, don't worry, the nervousness is shared as well. For those readers who perhaps might not have read your book or might not have found your Vanguard Chronicle series as well, can you give us a brief intro about yourself and the books that you write?
So I write predominantly grimdark gaslamp fantasy books. So the first question people always ask is, what is gaslamp fantasy? So gaslamp is sort of an aesthetic that is set in kind of industrial Victorian kind of era. I mean, essentially it's the kind of era where you would imagine seeing lamplighters lighting gas lights on the streets. So very Jack the Ripper-esque kind of setting. So the first book in the Vanguard Chronicles is We Men of Ash and Shadow, and the second one, which came out last April, I have to think about it there, is The Hand That Cast the Bone. The third one is currently in progress, so we're having a little break at the moment from that because the first draft is done. So I'm just kind of giving it a few weeks and then I'll go back and start the process of editing. So hopefully that will be out next year.
Yes. As a fan of these books, I can only tell you that I can't wait to read it, because the way you ended The Hand That Cast the Bone, that just ignited the series even more so for me, at least, and we'll talk more about that. But welcome today to this authors and their favorite books series that we at Fantasy Book Critic are talking about. I want you, so mainly, what is the book you've chosen and why did you choose it?
So the book I have chosen is Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. The reason I chose it is, initially when we first spoke and you kind of told me about this series and what you do and talking to all about favourite books, I did kind of go through several options, and actually Prince of Thorns is a book that's quite new to me. So I only read it, I think, about a year and a half ago. And since then, I think I've listened to the audiobook about 4 or 5 times, and I've read the paperback twice now. So I wanted to pick this one, because for me, it's a quite recent discovery, even though the book itself is obviously, 10 or so years old. But also in terms of when I read it as well, it was when I was really starting to try and discover who I wanted to be as a writer myself and what kind of, style I wanted to use, and, not necessarily emulate, but somebody who was doing what I wanted to do. So hence the reason I've chosen this one.
Well, that is a fascinating, that is fascinating itself. And yes, you're absolutely right. Prince of Thorns came more than 10 years ago, I think 10 or 11 years ago, somewhere in that time. But yeah, it has been a book that was heralded as like a huge thing in grimdark fantasy, which of course was not exactly prevalent back then. But I think it kind of started the trend, of course, with Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch coming before. Mark Lawrence kind of like really started the trend in the 2010s decade as well, with his debut. And of course, he's followed up with more books after that. One quick question before we get into more about this book. Was this the first Mark Lawrence book that you read, or did you read something else before you read Prince of Thorns?
Well, shocking confession, seeing as I've come onto a show to talk about Mark Lawrence's books, but it's actually the one and only book I've read so far. Full discretion, I am a terribly slow reader. I am really awful. So in any given year, I'll probably read about 6 novels total. Everything else I read is short story forms or things like that. I have the full series ready to go, and I thought in the lead up to this, I'll start reading all the follow-up ones, because that was always my intention anyway. But unfortunately in my house, we have one Kindle and my husband has beaten me to it. So he's currently on the second book and is constantly trying to give me spoilers for it. So I have to run around the house avoiding him.
Well, that's a fair point. And between you and Mark, you have read his book, he hasn't read yours. So you're one up on him.
This is true.
Which is absolutely okay. And now, of course, you have like his huge backlog to kind of go through as you go about it slowly. So it's completely understandable. Thank you for sharing that information about this book, or about Mark Lawrence. Now, I want to talk to you about this book. What makes it so special for you? You know, the characters, was it the plot setting, was it the grim darkness of, or just the writing? What would you say was the number one draw for you?
Oh, I mean, that's a really good question, because I think there's definitely several aspects of it that, I really enjoyed reading. But I think what appeals to me as a reader and what appeals to me as a writer are probably two separate things. So as a reader, it was definitely for me the character of Jorg is just, I think he's one of the most well-developed characters I've ever come across. And, I know obviously, he does a lot of things that people don't like, and he's not a particularly nice character. But in terms of understanding him and his development and his journey, I do feel the way he kind of goes through the narrative is really interesting for me, because what I find with a lot of character development is you're being given the character story as they are, whereas with Jorg, it's a really fantastic demonstration of a character really believing their own narrative. And we're learning about Jorg as he perceives him to be, and also how he thinks the world perceives him. So there's, right from the start, there's almost like a little skewer to his reality. He's built his own world around him. On the kind of the second point, from the writer's point of view, for me, a lot of it is the prose that Mark Lawrence uses, and the way in which, and I know we'll pick up on a couple of favourite quotes later, but it's the way it feels very sensory. So, it's one of those books where you can kind of, that strange thing where you can taste an atmosphere. So people talk about being able to taste tension in the room. There's a lot of that, and I think he does that really, really well.
That is definitely true. You brought up like really fascinating points, about, by the way, is it Jorg or Jorg? I don't know. I've always pronounced it in my head. It was the J has become as Jorg. So is it Jorg? Do you know if that's the official pronunciation?
Well, funnily enough, me and my husband were having this exact same debate this morning when I was getting ready to come on here. I think it's Jorg, because I'm fairly sure that in the audiobook it's pronounced as Jorg. So then, I could be wrong, but we'll go with that.
No, we'll go with Jorg, because the audiobook is kind of like the only way for us to kind of, be like, because that's official author approved pronunciation. So I'm going to go with Jorg as well. But yeah, all this while, past 11 years, in my, I thought it was Jorg. So Mark, if you're watching this, forgive me. You brought up these fascinating points about, Jorg Ankrad being this, well, no, I wouldn't say devious, but being this fascinating character, because, he has his own reality about him. And then as the reader, as we go along, we are presented snippets and facets of his past, because this book has this interesting kind of like dual, not exactly dual timeline, but, dual timeline-ish aspect of the plot. And then you, of course, mentioned the atmosphere. I want to talk more about the atmosphere, because the thing which you mentioned, that that people can taste it, people are fascinated by it, because at first it seems medieval-esque, but then there's something more to it. Would you say that's a fair characterization, fair point, or no?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's part of what makes it an interesting world, is that it does, especially in the earlier parts of the book, it does kind of follow that aesthetic of like medieval fantasy that we see in a lot of other books. But then I think the fact that Mark pulls in things that are very kind of real world and very kind of relatable to us, maybe not so from our own time, but from kind of more recent history, I think that gives it that element of grittiness and realness. So yeah, I think it's interesting the way he kind of pulls those two things together.
Oh, that is very true. And let's talk a little bit more about Jorg, because he's very fascinating, and he's very divisive as well. People have gone into this book thinking, of course, thinking one thing about it and come out thinking another, or people who just went in blank, they were like horrified, but yet they could understand him. That's one thing which I've realized, from reading a lot of reviews, and even when I read the book as well, that you might not like him, but you understand him. Would you say that's a fair, was that your, was that how you found him to be?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, obviously I can understand, he's a character that, like you say, is going to be divisive, and people are going to not like him because of the things that he does. For me, I think what I find most interesting is if you actually look at the actions he takes, the decisions he makes, even the horrible things he does throughout the story, you know, they are essentially really no different to what many hundreds of fantasy heroes do. The difference is the character's perception of it, and also how kind of the narrative builds him to be, you know, this dark and grey character. So to give you an example, you know, we look at things like, you know, Vikings and Ragnar Lothbrok, you know, and maybe you wouldn't go so far as to call him a hero, but for a lot of people, you know, Ragnar was the hero of Vikings. Yet again, he goes out and he murders, he pillages, you know, he kills people. The difference is that in Ragnar's mind, he is the hero of his own story. In York's mind, he is almost the villain of his own story. And he kind of not plays up to that, but almost accepts it as, you know, this is his destiny. He is, you know, a terrible monster, so he's going to go out and do what terrible monsters do. Even if you look through kind of, you know, outside of fiction, through history, you know, wars and, you know, conquerors and things like that, all the things that York does are basically the same as what all conquering warlords do. Yet, you know, because of the way that he presents himself, as well as the way the story presents it, he is seen as, you know, being terrible. I'm not saying that he's not, but I think, you know, there's definitely a little bit of a grey area there.
No, that's a very fascinating point you brought up, especially because when you look back at history, you know, there have been, like, I don't want to say evil, but there have been warlords that have been conquering, you know, kings and emperors. And it depends on the perception of how they're written about. Like, for example, I think Alexander, everybody has this romantic view of Alexander, you know, like that he was this, you know, young boy who conquered, you know, at least at that time, 1/4 of the known world. I'm sure the Persians and the people in the Middle East have a totally different perception of him. But like Europeans, as well as, you know, Asians, when we read the European literature, there's like this romantic view of Alexander. Switching on the other side, Genghis Khan, you know, the Mongol warlord, I would say he's kind of and sorry to be going off on this track, but he's kind of more in the vein of York. You know, he doesn't think of him as a hero. He thought of himself as, like, you know, in his own mind, a person who was meant to conquer because it was his due and right, and he accepted it for what it was. He made no qualms about it. That I'm here to conquer, and I'm here to conquer by any which way. I feel like York kind of embodies that vein of thinking, so more so than Alexander.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what really is interesting as well is that when you actually go through and read the book, there are, you know, I mean, there's a couple of times where York obviously is clearly getting some kind of satisfaction out of what he's doing. But for the most part, when he's talking about these, you know, towns that he's burning and sacking, things like that, he's talking about the skill of it. He's talking about the artistry of it. He's talking about the technique of it. Very little of his kind of narrative around that is, you know, him gloating, you know, or, you know, having a great time doing it. To him, he has a purpose and he's fulfilling it.
You mentioned this purpose, and you mentioned this in the start as well. Like, you know, he believes he's the villain of his own story. It kind of brings to the mind the quote from Shakespeare, you know, "To thine old self be true." I think he has kind of embodied and accepted that. And of course, there's more to it as well within the story, because, you know, sometimes you know, and this is a bit of spoilers, dear viewers, forgive us for us. This book has been out for more than 10-12 years, so there will be some spoilers. We are given hints that perhaps he's not in his right mind, or there's something else going on as well, and which we find out later on. There is indeed more to the story. Coming back to this world and the grim darkness of it as well, because you mentioned, you know, there's pillaging, there's murder, there's a lot of nasty stuff, but it's not. It's shown to be wild, and York talks about it, you know, that it is wild, but he still does it. From a writerly perspective, what did you make of that? You know, because you're a reader as well, but you're a writer too. How did you find this approach to be from this unique debut?
I mean, in terms of approaching kind of just grimdark in general, I think that, I mean, obviously there's lots of arguments about, you know, what grimdark is and how it should work, but I think that as long as what you're doing and what you're writing is purposeful to the story, and I think there is a really thin line between what is purposeful and what is gratuitous. So, you know, I think, again, with the way that Mark Lawrence wrote this book, is that yes, you're talking about, you know, lots of battles and horrible murders and things like that, but the scale of it is actually, comparatively to other books, quite small. So, you know, you look at things like Lord of the Rings, where you've got huge battles where thousands and thousands of soldiers are, you know, getting mown down on the battlefield, whereas this, you know, you're talking about kind of it's your one-on-one with a particular character from a certain town, or talking about the blacksmith's son, or just I can't think of a specific example, but it is very bloody, it is very violent, it is very grimdark, but it's also moments between people in a very small frame, which kind of gives it a realness that you might not get with a big battle, because obviously big battles are very hard for readers to kind of imagine, because it's the scale of it is vast, whereas this, I think it almost feels more personal in a way. These are real characters, these are real people that are being affected by these terrible things York's doing, yet he's connecting to them right from the start of the story, when he's in, I want to say Mab, and I might be pronouncing that wrong, the very first village, and despite the fact that he's done this attack on it and he's killed these people, the interaction we have is with him and this one particular man, and it gives that particular man a character, it gives him a background, it makes him a real person.
And that's true. That's a very fascinating point. There's often snippets of dialogue, and he talks about all of his band of brothers, his horrible band of brothers. But there's these quotes about like someone having kind eyes, yet being a murderer. Someone being like the Nubian, who can be trusted as a rock, but yes, he's also a killer. So there's all these fascinating snippets. Within the story, what were your favorite parts about York, or like moments with York, and perhaps what were some of your I don't want to say not favorite, but just like horrendous parts what he does? Would you?
Good question. In terms of favorite parts, I mean, there's a lot to choose from. I know we said that we were fine doing spoilers, but I always get slightly nervous doing spoilery stuff. So, I think for me, one of the big things was York's, not just his relationship, but some of the kind of the scenes with his father. For me, really stood out in the book. I think that's a really interesting dynamic between them. And I think in terms of York's character, I think his reaction and his relationship with his father is very telling of something underlying that even York as a character himself won't admit to. It comes out in snippets, so we see kind of, almost like a level of fear for his father. But also there's a real level of love as well. Essentially, a lot of what York does is because he wants the validation from his father, even if he won't admit it. He wants to know that he means something. And essentially, a lot of the stuff he does is to get his father's attention, and to, it's almost like he can't decide if he wants to anger his father or please him, and it's a constant conflict. So I really like that, especially kind of when he first returns home after his years away, and he has this strange contradiction in his feelings where, he wants to go in and show his father who he's become and what he's done. And there's this kind of pride and this swagger to it. And yet, as soon as he gets to within where he can see his father's castle, the character kind of shrinks into himself, and he reverts to that kind of childlike, almost reverence of his father. So I'd say that for me was one of them. Another one is I really liked the tourney scene at the end of the book, just because that was just wall-to-wall action, and I just really loved the way, I can go on about prose and stuff like that, but that was just a really good action scene. And I like the fact that, again, really nervous because I'm talking spoiler stuff, but his kind of final showdown with oh God, I'm going to pronounce the name wrong. That's it. Corian, I want to say. Corian, yeah. Their kind of final showdown, and the fact that after everything York had been through, it really came down to just a moment of fate that, kind of had him survive that moment and actually defeat Corian and have that victory. It wasn't his victory. It was completely, by chance, which to me makes it kind of more real, because that's how battles go. It's completely chance, and you could be the most skilled person on the battlefield, but if you're in the wrong place at the wrong moment, you're not going to win. So I thought that was really clever, the way that Mark Lawrence did that.
That's such a fascinating point. He definitely does this, where he presents like he gives these real life scenarios to this fantasy story as well. And especially that ending which you mentioned, and I think your references it as well. I won't spoil book 2 for you, because book 2 is kind of dials all of this to 11, I feel, because with book 1 you're just discovering York. With book 2 you kind of, when you get like you're immediately, when you start out, you already know what York is, and then he does something else as well, because it's fascinating. So I'll love to hear what you think about York in book 2 in the King of Thrones. We'll shift a little bit, from York's character to maybe a little bit of the world, because I find like, the world building was very unique, at least at that time. When we of course, it begins out in a medievalistic setting, which everybody knows, everybody expects, but then there's something more to it. What were your thoughts about the world building and just the world presented in the first books, generally?
I mean, I found that with kind of the first half of the book, I think it definitely kind of met that, I can't pronounce words now, met those expectations of what the world should be like, especially in terms of, it's like taverns and inns and dusty roads and things like that. What I did really like was the shift, kind of, I don't want to say where it comes, it's probably about halfway through, where you start getting the more magical elements as well, so like the necromancy. So I think, again, that almost felt like it moved into a slightly different area from where it started. So you've kind of got the medieval world, which you recognize in the middle, and then you've kind of got the more magical like side of it going this way, but then you've also got the real world side of it, where they talk about like writers and religions and things like that, that we find very recognizable. And yeah, I think it didn't feel like it was different books, but it almost felt like traveling slightly through different worlds. So especially with the kind of the mountain and the necromancy bit, almost felt like going through a bit of a portal to me, even though that wasn't necessarily what happened. But I really like the way that was done.
No, you're really right, because there's like, at first we don't really realize it, that we think that it's a secondary fantasy world, but then slowly you start getting these hints that, hey, maybe there's something it's not maybe a secondary fantasy world, it's something that we know, and then of course there's more to it in this book and the latter books, that we truly find out what it truly is. Besides the world building, I want to talk also about the story structure, because you have the story's viewpoint is through York only, and most of the chapters are set in the present timeline, but then there's a few chapters which go 4 years back, and this has been like a unique aspect of the entire trilogy. When you were reading it, did you find that jarring? Did you find that interesting? What was your reaction to it?
No, I actually found it really interesting. And the thing that I found most interesting about it was that you would almost expect that you have the one part of the story which is in kind of present day, where York was who he was now, but that going back, you would find that, you'd expect maybe he started out as a sweet young prince, and he was, playing with his, royal toys or whatever it is that young princes do. And that you would see the kind of development of how he became that character. What was interesting was that York was already sort of that character anyway, before the incident happened with, his mother and his brother, and all this. So, you see it through the snippets you get with him and his tutor, where he's questioning the world. And even from a very young age, York has his own perception of how the world works. And really, from what you can see, it's not based on a huge amount other than how he naturally feels himself. He hasn't really had hugely traumatic experiences. He talks about enjoying his time spent with his mother, and his father kind of doesn't pay him any attention, but that's what you'd expect for a young prince in that situation. So even right from the start, you can kind of see those snippets of York's kind of underlying personality, which are naturally there. So it's not 100% the experiences and the trauma that have built him. There is a part of him that is very cynical and very kind of ambitious and kind of power hungry right from the early ages.
And of course, this incident, which we talk about, which happened in the past, kind of just brings it out to the fore even quicker as well. Coming back to York just for a little bit, he's shown to be a 14-year-old. He's shown to be a 14-year-old when we meet him. He's doing some really horrid things, but also some Action, with the action sequences, it's kind of like, there's a level of disbelief, to be brought in, because a 14-year-old is doing certain really physical things. He's shown to be smarter than most of his band of brothers, and the band of brothers, even though they're called band of brothers, they're not really brothers. They're these wild men, so to speak, who are murderers, who are pillagers, who are just the worst of the worst, and yet he's their leader. Some reviewers found that to be a sticky point. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, because it's a fantasy world after all. But what were your thoughts about that? That with regards to his age and him being so mature physically and emotionally, well, not a chance to say emotionally, but mentally or sociopathically.
I mean, I'd say a couple of points on that. I mean, firstly, I think, when we look back historically, it's not beyond the realms of reality for people of that age to be going out and taking an active part in wars and things. I mean, you look at I'm currently reading the biography of Empress Matilda and how she brought her son Henry to the throne, and he was coming over between Normandy and England by the ages of 12, 13, 14. He was out marauding with knights and things. So it does happen. Would they necessarily be able to do these crazy intricate up close fight scenes? Possibly not. But I think for the most part with Jorg as well, when he is doing these scenes, a lot of it is him doing things kind of from melee range as well. So there's a lot of arrow use, and there's a lot of throwing things, and even when he is up close quarters with people, 90% of it is talk, rather than action. So yes, you may have to suspend belief a little bit, but we have to remember this is Jorg's story that he's telling through his own eyes. Who knows, if you were a 14-year-old warlord, you'd probably embellish things and make them more exciting than they actually were. So who knows, maybe it wasn't quite as elaborate as he explains. But I think it's one of those things. At the end of the day, it's a fantasy, and if we can believe that Superman can fly around the world, we can believe that Jorg can beat these great knights in armor. That's what fantasy is.
That's true. And as a counterpoint to this, if Jorg was a hero, imagine if this was like a heroic book where Jorg was a hero and a 14-year-old doing all of these things, a lot less people would be doubting his skills as well. To bring just to a counterpoint, in A Song of Ice and Fire, Jon Snow, he's around the same age as well. Maybe he's a few years older, but he's around the same age when he does these heroic things with his sword and everything like that. And people batted a lot less eyelids at that than maybe say at Jorg's and his physical antics as well. I thought that was really funny when I read some of the reviews. Now I want to talk about Mark Lawrence's prose. I know you are a fan of it as well. In my mind, he's one of the most sublime writers out there. There's a bit of Gene Wolfe to him in the sense that he might be writing about sometimes mundane things. He might be sometimes write about magical things, but his prose always manages to make it special. Any thoughts about that? Are there any certain quotes or sentences which kind of stood out to you within the story?
Oh gosh, loads. I mean, I think for me, the prose in this book is, and it sounds really weird when I say it like this, but the best word I can use to describe it is it's really delicious prose. It's just delicious. It's, I think I mentioned earlier, it's so kind of sensory. There's so much taste to it. There's so much noise and atmosphere to it. I love the moments, and I know it's obviously all from Jorg's perspective, but the moments of kind of inner narrative and inner dialogue that Jorg has, where he really kind of reveals himself and his thoughts. I mean, I could literally talk for about an hour just on the scene with the Lichway Road, which is very early in the book. And really, I think that chapter probably tells you almost everything you need to know about who Jorg is and why he is the way he is right from the start. In terms of kind of his perspective about death and fear and things like that. And I'm terrible for quotes. I can never, so please feel free to jump in if you want to be more specific. But one of my favorite quotes is the one about I'm going to completely mess this up now. Being able to paint on the darkness in a quiet moment.
Yep, I can read that out to you. Is it this one? The quote says, "The monsters came when the light failed. Shadows swallowed the gorge, and the silence thickened until the wind could barely stir it." Is that the one which you're referring to?
That's from later in the book, but yeah, that one I do love, and that one again, I kind of selected that because it's that sensory kind of feel again. And also what I think Mark Lawrence does throughout the book as well is that York almost makes a monster of his own mind. So his kind of thought process almost becomes a character of its own outside of York. And obviously later in the book we kind of find out that, you know, he's not fully in control of this, and we don't know which is him and which is kind of him being controlled. But just that kind of description of how he feels, especially about darkness, you know, and almost giving it a character of itself. You know, I think that's really interesting and it's really clever.
Oh, and I think I found it. May I read it out if that's okay?
Yeah.
It says, "I'll tell you now, the silence almost beat me. It's the silence that scares me. It's the blank page on which I can write my own fears. The spirits of the dead have nothing on it. The dead one tried to show me hell. It was a pale imitation of the horror I can paint on the darkness in a quiet moment." This is so visceral. This is so visceral and so good.
It's just, I mean, that's just like chef's kiss, fantastic. Drop the mic, walk away. You know, I could write for 100 years and I would never write anything as perfect as that quote. You know, I actually have that quote saved on my laptop.
Nice.
And I actually just keep it as like a little motivator when I'm writing myself, even though I know I'll never meet that level. But, you know, it's nice to have that motivator. I mean, it's just perfect. I mean, that is a masterclass in internal fear. And also that self kind of, not self-assurance, that's the wrong word, but that kind of knowledge of self that York has, that, you know, he can face monsters outside, he can face, you know, nights, demons. Nothing is ever going to be as awful as what he can imagine in his own mind. And I think for me, and probably many other people, that's really relatable, you know, because we go through what ifs and we go, oh no, what if this, and we paint these horrible, monstrous, you know, scenarios in our head, and they're probably much more terrifying than anything we'll actually face. So I mean, that quote is probably one of my favorite in any book ever.
No, that is very fascinating. I also find like there's other, and there's bigger quotes like this, and there's smaller quotes as well. Like I'm just going to read out a couple of them because I thought they're really small, but they're snappy. Like there's this one, hate will keep you alive where love fails. Of course, there's like a longer statement to this, but it just the simple statement of it is what really motivates him. And you kind of mentioned this as well with his feelings towards his father, and it kind of embodies what basically this book is going to be about. That's one. There's another one like this, about memories. Memories are dangerous things. You turn them over and over until you know every touching corner, but still you find an edge to cut you. This is brilliant. I like you mentioned, with his prose, there's just so much to it, and especially if you reread it, there's just more and more to discover as well, because there's always these small tiny facets which you think that, or at least for me, I found that I've missed. And then I reread the book, I'm like, oh, this is something more to discover as well. Coming back to this prose, you mentioned there's the fact that that there's the darkness within York, which is kind of mentioned, and it kind of, he paints a picture of it as well, and then later on we find out that there's more to it as well. From a writerly perspective, when you were reading that, did you think did you try to make sorry, my question is in regards to that, is that did you feel that this was just the author painting the picture to kind of make it more vivid, or did you find that there was something more to it, which of course was proven true towards the end? Like which camp did you fall in?
I mean, I think for me, in terms of so I'm gonna have to think about this one now. I mean, no, it's okay. I think all the way through it, I think the thing that really stood out to me is that we're reading not necessarily we do find out what happened, but we don't necessarily find it out in a kind of factual, this is what happened, this is how it works. We're finding out through York's interpretation, his narrative of it. So I don't even feel like I'm going to answer the question here again. So sorry, just go through the question again for me.
Sure. What I was basically saying that, that there's the darkness that is painted, at first we're not sure. So did you think that it was just to paint a vivid picture? Or did you, as a reader, feel that, no, this is hinting at something more? And then, of course, at the end, we found that to be true. Which camp did
Yes,
you fall
okay.
in?
I know where I was going with my answer
Yeah.
now. So yeah, so I think it kind of almost is painting a vivid picture, but I think that it's, rather than Mark telling us the story, this is Jorg painting the picture to almost make it more fearful in his own mind. So, you know, you've got this young child that's gone through this traumatic experience, but you know, a lot of the things he kind of focuses on is like, you know, the thorns obviously holding on to him, which is very kind of poetic and very kind of artistic.
Mhm.
You know, it's not necessarily in that situation what you might remember. You know, you would think that the screams of his mother would be more prevalent in his mind than so it almost feels like this story that Jorg tells is his way of being able to tell it. You know, he tells it from the perspective of, you know, almost like a bard, almost like in a horrible way.
Mhm.
You know, it doesn't kind of soften it, but it almost makes it more epic. And again, I think that goes back to, you know, he's a young character, he's a young man, and he's, you know, trying to tell his own story in the way that he feels most comfortable with and he can kind of relate to the most. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm going to go with
It
that.
does. No, it definitely does, because you bring up this point previously as well. Like, you know, he's a young person. In some chapters, he's a younger person. He's 9 years old when we kind of see it in his past, and of course, through his 14-year-old eyes, we're seeing the world. And he's also been through so much trauma that his worldview has shifted. Yes, he had those pointers within him, but his worldview has shifted dramatically in a much different direction. Um, so there is a bit of unreliableness to his narration, like you correctly mentioned. Perhaps less so, maybe from, you know, similar to what maybe Quoth does in the, you know, the Kingkiller Chronicles. But there is a little bit of unreliableness, and we find out more and more about this later on as well. Coming lastly back to to Mark's prose, and of course we'll move on after this as well. What I found fascinating with Mark's prose was that, you know, there's these small aspects of it where he talks about, like, you know, not just Jorg and the world, but there's other aspects which you can apply to, like, you know, general life as well. Were there any such? Did you find something like this to be true, or is it just me talking too much about it?
I mean, in terms of kind of the other characters, do you mean, and
Hmm.
things? I mean, yeah, I think that there's definitely, it's your story, but you know, I think there are, especially within the kind of the brotherhood that he has, you know, there are these fleeting characters who have huge impacts on the story, even with, you know, maybe very little kind of interaction. So, you know, you look at oh God, I've forgotten the queen's name now, but the queen that
Oh,
his, is it Sereth, something like that?
I'm bad with names as well.
Yeah, but the queen that his father remarries afterwards, you know, and
Hmm.
his kind of very few interactions with her, you know, again, it kind of brings in, I can't think what the right word is, but it's not like an enemy, but it brings in another dynamic to what
Hmm.
York has to achieve, because now obviously it's not just his father that he's facing, it's there is now a line, there's a hereditary line that he's going to obviously at some point have to deal with. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, and I just think that kind of the characters around him, like you mentioned earlier as well, the fact that a lot of them, you know, they're warriors and they're killers and they're murderers and they're thieves and stuff like that, but you know,
Hmm.
they also have the kind eyes, or you know, you've got the oh God, why am I so terrible with names? I've literally read this book so many times, but there's the one that's always eating,
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
so it's like
I
a
know.
constant theme.
Yep. He's constantly eating, and then he's big as well. And say then calls him, like, well, if big is a virtue, is big a virtue for him? Yeah, there's a lot of brothers and I'm bad with names, but I think I know whom you're referring to as well.
Yeah, so yeah,
Uh,
I like that.
I think the second queen's name, or the person whom his father remarries, is Scareth, if I'm not, or Sarath
I
Abscoron.
thought it was something like that,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's the names don't flow off the tongue as easily as well, so it's completely okay. One last thing I do, well, not one last thing, maybe a couple of things I do want to ask you before we kind of move on to some other topics is, you mentioned you're a rereader. You know, I love that. I am a rereader as well. I can reread a book as many times. And you mentioned that you've also heard the audiobook 4 times, and then you've read the book a couple of times. Uh, in your opinion, which one was more enjoyable for you?
um I think For me, I would say I prefer the audiobook on this. I enjoy reading it in both formats, but I think the narrator, and I apologise, I don't know the name of who did it. I think he really took on the tone and kind of the intonations and the patterns that I would expect from somebody having those thought processes. So, you know, the way he presented York, I thought really felt true to the character. And I mean, some of the kind of the styling of how he talks as well. I mean, I don't want to use the word flippant because it's not flippant, but there is definitely a kind of casualness to the way that York speaks, even when he's talking about things that are very traumatic. And I felt he did that really, really well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I just looked it up. I think it's James Clamp. Is that the narrator who kind of rings a bell for you? Did you hear it on Audible? If it was Audible, it was
Yeah,
James Clamp. Then I think it is James Clamp. I have not heard the audios, which is why. But you're right. But the flippantness is there in York's entire narration. Like, you know, there's a bit of flippantness when he's describing his band of brothers killing people. There's a bit of flippantness when he's describing his father and his proclivities now that, you know, his mother and his brother have gone. So there's that angry edge to him as well, which comes out in this, you know, this casual, I don't know, you know, making light of situations which perhaps nobody else would as well. So there's definitely that. So I'm now actually interested to hear the story, because you mentioned that it's that the narrator has brought the tone out. Shifting a little bit to a different aspect of the book, you know, I know that this, and of course, Mark Lawrence has kind of talked about this as well. This book often gets accused of misogyny, you know, as there are quite some heinous events occurring within, you know. But to my mind, this book is also from, like, you know, the singular POV of a murderous sociopath, you know, which is York Ankrat, you know, who of course may or may not be completely in control. You know, as a writer yourself who writes in, like you mentioned, you know, a grimdark gaslamp world, where there are morally clear characters, the situations aren't always good, and the world is of course unforgiving. Perhaps not as unforgiving as, you know, this one, but it is still unforgiving. What's your take on this?
I mean, coming at it from a more of a writer's perspective, I think that, you know, it is a very difficult thing to walk that line when you're writing grimdark between, like I said earlier, something that is gratuitous and something that is important to the storyline. And I think there's several aspects which, you know, you have to really take into account when you are writing these things. One is the intention of it, you know, and whether it's purposeful for the story, whether it is there to teach a lesson or to you know, explain something in a way that you couldn't do without it. And again, I think the important thing is that in those situations that the characters should always have agency, and they should also always have logic and reasoning. You know, it's very easy to have someone going out and slashing a sword around and, you know, attacking young maidens and things like that, because that's, you know, what people expect to see in fantasy. I think to give it reason and to make it part of a wider narrative that has purpose is very difficult. And I've seen examples of it done really well. I've seen examples of it done really badly. In terms of kind of people's perceptions of grimdark, I think, you know, I don't read these stories because I want to see terrible things happening to good people. I read these stories because I want to see something that is gritty and realistic, but shows the consequences and the reactions and how people deal with these situations. And, you know, I think it's, to me, it's kind of akin to people who like, you know, reading serial killer profiles and watching documentaries on them. You know, it's not because you're entertained by these terrible things, it's a need to understand them, and it's a need to understand the drive and the logic and the psychology behind it, or at least that is what it is for me, you know. And I think everyone has their own tolerance level when it comes to grimdark, you know, and I think that everybody has their own take on what they would find acceptable. So, you know, I think it's just a case of trying to do the best job that you can with that material and not do it just for the sake of it, because, you know, then it is going to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. No, and you bring a fascinating point. The people who, like, serial killers are a huge staple of thriller fiction. They have been a huge thriller, like, you know, staple since, like, as far as I remember, since the 1980s or even more, you know, with Hannibal Lecter and all of those. True crime documentaries, you know, people who will never read books, but they will watch these true crime documentaries, because you're right, people are fascinated by the not mundane, so as to speak, because our normal lives are mundane. And I hope they stay that way. And I'm not meaning that in a bad way, but just that, there is the books that we read, they perhaps give us a picture into a world which is not the same as ours. And which is why I think people are drawn by the dark and the grimy and, like you mentioned, things which can make your skin crawl. So I totally understand that. And to your point as well, yes, it is, there's a fine line between making it for just gratuitous reasons and for doing it for a purpose. And I think in this Prince of Thorns book, there is a purpose to it, which we of course find out in this book and towards the latter half of it as well. Lastly, I have found that, many writers, they say that, they cannot read in the genre that they write in. Was this the case for you? Has this never been a problem for you? Or is it just that with this book, it overcame everything that, might have caused a problem for you?
I mean, I admit quite freely that I am not a good reader. It is the bane of my life that I am a bad reader as a writer, because people are constantly telling me to read more. But I think, I don't struggle to read the genre that I write in. I think what I struggle with is more kind of classic, traditional fantasy. Because I tend to find that if I read that, then I can't get out of that mindset, whereas I think reading something like Prince of Thorns, that almost feels like it opens up so many possibilities for me, because like we've said, Mark Lawrence completely subverts expectations in his world building, that he brings in things you would never have thought about. So yeah, I mean, I find that I read a lot of kind of like indie author books. I read a lot of kind of like grimdark, SPFBO, that kind of thing. And I think that the kind of breadth and scope of the kind of fantasy that I write in is very wide. So, you could have like 5 or 6 different grimdark books, and they're all going to be completely different. They're all going to be different worlds, they're going to be different time periods. So, I don't feel that I get stuck in that kind of narrow window of, this is the genre and this is how the genre is supposed to be. Grimdark is a flavor, I think.
Yep. No, that's very true. It can be a science fiction book, it can be a fantasy book, it can be a thriller book. That's lovely. Thank you so much for saying that. And before we come to an end with the Prince of Thorns discussion, I want to ask you, or would it be possible for you to maybe tell our viewers as to why they should read Prince of Thorns? Like, in your estimate as a reader, what would be your way of describing why they should read it? Do you want to take a stab at it?
Oh, the pressure now. I mean, I would say that, Prince of Thorns, as just an introduction itself to Mark Lawrence's work, I think it's a really good kind of example of character development in a grimdark world, where it is a character who is completely, I don't want to say morally grey. He's not morally grey, he's very morally dark. But it is a book where it's going to introduce you to reasoning and perspective, and perception from that character's point of view. And I think it's just a stunning work of prose, and I would recommend it until the end of time. So I probably can't say anything better than that, but yeah.
That in itself is a quote for Mark Lawrence, a stunning work of prose. So
I'm sure he'd be thrilled.
Yeah, he should be. He definitely should be. So Holly, thank you so much for your time and for talking about Prince of Thorns. Now that comes and we kind of bring to an end to that discussion. But I do want to have you a little bit longer, because I do want to talk to you about your books as well, because that is my hook to get you on to talk. Because I am a big fan of the Vanguard Chronicles. We Men of Ash and Shadow. I know I had reached out to you before SPFU began, because I had seen the cover, the book's blurb kind of drew me in. I really enjoyed it, and I was super thrilled when I found out that it was going to be a finalist. And so that must have, how did that feel for you? Like, when you debutante book, you go in SPFU. Of course, I realized it's like it is like a big thing, but then you find out that your book ends up being a finalist. What were your state of emotions when you found out that to be true?
Kind of all over the place, to be honest. I mean, the whole experience was just really amazing and really surreal. I mean, you enter these competitions and you hope to do well, and you hope to get some reviews out of it and to get some new readership out of it. But I got so much more from it. And and especially getting through to the finals, I feel exceptionally grateful to have been put in a position where, you know, I've spoken to people I wouldn't necessarily spoken to, and I've discovered, you know, new bloggers, new readers, you know, new people within the writing community. So yeah, and there was such a spirit of camaraderie to it as well, which was really nice to have as well, the kind of support of the other finalists. And yeah, and obviously Mark Lawrence, you know, he kind of does this to shine a light on indie books, so it's fantastic that he uses his platform to do that as well.
Oh, I can't thank him enough. Like, you know, I remember like back in the days, this was like 10, 12 years ago, when indie books were still, or self-published was still kind of looked upon, and we only had like a few gems here and there. But since the competition has come in from 2015 onwards, and, you know, I think it's just with more writers discovering that there is a way to get their books published, it has led to this just enormous flood of books. And of course, you know, there's going to be some sludge, but there's been just this beauty of books coming through from different genres and different combinations, which were never even thought possible. So I'm super glad for that. Did you all writers, or did you all finalists have like a secret group to kind of vent your feelings or expressions when you're receiving those reviews? Or
I mean, to be honest, I don't think there was much secret about it, because I think there was a whole thing on Twitter about frogicorns or something
yes.
like that. I mean, honestly, I wouldn't say I'm like not a social person. I'm a very social person, but during that time I was preparing to bring out the second book, so I was very kind of initially focused on that. So I was kind of dipping in and out of talking to the other finalists, so I probably wasn't as present as some of the others, and they were incredibly understanding about that, because as authors, you know, they obviously understand the pressures of getting a book out. But I mean, just kind of one-on-one, I mean, I'm really good friends with a lot of the authors that were in the finals, so we've kind of been speaking for a while before, and obviously we've kept speaking after. So, you know, Tim Hardy was in there with me. We've been friends for a couple of years. Crystal Maytar, we've kind of been friends for a few years. So it was very nice to have that familiarity with people. So you kind of already knew them before you started. So we got very lucky that we kind of knew a lot of each other.
Well, I have to ask this then. How did you, you know, because you mentioned, I know your friendship with Tim Hardy, but I didn't know about your friendship with Crystal Matar. How did you get to know them beforehand? Like, you know, is it to a writers group, through Facebook, or just happenstance?
I mean, I think it's kind of different for everyone. I mean, I think me and Crystal kind of crossed paths by being mutually kind of tagged in things, and especially because we kind of bought our debuts very close together, and because we kind of, although our books are very different, we both write in that kind of gas lamp, slightly military-esque style, and especially for me, it was very kind of nice to find another author who writes in a similar kind of style and setting to me. So we kind of had like our little discussions on social media, and you know, I mean, I call her my grim sister now, you know, so we're bonded for life, basically, just because, you know, we're kind of not in a genre that's not very popular, but it's a genre that not many people really know about. So I think we kind of feel like we give each other a little bit of support.
Oh, that's pretty cool. And how did you and Tim Hardy come to know each other?
I came to kind of get talking to Tim. He basically was looking for review and art crime readers for his first book, and he sent we talked on social media, and he sent me a message saying, would I be interested in having a copy of his book. And I feel terrible, because at the time I was really busy. I was kind of getting snowed under with requests, because for some reason I'd had about 10 requests to read people's books in about a week, and you know,
wow.
I say 10 books would take me about 3 years to read. So initially I said no, and then a couple of days later I kind of had a spare hour, and I thought I'll just go on Amazon and I'll flick through these books that people have told me about, and I'll start, you know, just read the first chapter to see if any of them catch my attention. Yeah, and I read the first chapter of Ball of Bones, and I think about 6 hours later I sent him a message on social media saying, how dare you write this book? Now I'm going to have to read the whole thing. And you know, I loved it, and I was a really big fan of it. So we kind of got talking, and yeah, and we've talked ever since. And again, you know, he's been a massive support for me.
No, and kudos to him as well. I hear Hall of Bones, did really well. Of course, it was a SPFPO finalist as well. So I find that's a very funny coincidence, but it's a very cute coincidence as well. And I'm glad that you all were able to find each other as friends, but also then find each other in a professional, semi-professional setting, as SPFPO finalists, because that's a unique group to be in. I want to talk something about your books because I've found this to be very unique. Your titles, they are very, very, very evocative. I don't know what it is about them, and I apologize if this is kind of if this is one of those questions of similar to how the writers get, where did you get your ideas from? But I'm very curious as to how you come to the name to your naming patterns. We Men of Ash and Shadow. It kind of conveys something. At least in my mind, when I close my eyes, I kind of get a feeling. The hand that casts the bone, again, not maybe it doesn't bring zombie to mind, but again, with following on from We Men of Ash and Shadow, there's a very certain lyrical quality to it. So what's the magic or what's the secret sauce for your titles?
I mean, I wish I knew. I really do, because I'm trying to name the third book at the moment, and that's a nightmare because the pressure's high now. I mean, I always like it when books are lines, book titles are lines from the book. I think there's something strangely exciting about reading the book and kind of finding the chapter where the title comes from, and kind of better understanding what that title means. I mean, We Men of Ash and Shadow, I think that came to me while I was out walking the dog, which is where I tend to have all of my ideas, because it's where I've got no pen and paper to write them down. And then The Hand That Cast the Bone, that kind of went through several different iterations. I mean, initially my plan was that I was going to have almost like a fire theme throughout so it was going to start with We Men of Ash and Shadow, and then it was going to start with like the sparks of something or embers of something, and it was going to kind of build through that. And I couldn't find one that stuck. And then I think I wrote the chapter where it talks about the hand that cast the bone, and it almost felt like my chaos is a ladder moment. So I just kind of went, yeah, that's the title. I'm gonna have to stick with that now.
No, it's fantastic. Like I can tell you, like it's so rare to find fantasy because of course, I know Mark does this Wordle, they're not Wordle, but basically he kind of collects the titles and then the most biggest titles show up. So there's like all of these titles, like the Shadow, the Dragon, the King, blah blah blah. They're common, but your titles are not common. They might have certain words like shadow or hand or bone, but they're not common. The way you phrase the sentences together, there's a lyrical quality to them, and it just draws your eye. At least for me, it's like that title draws me in, and of course the blurb and the cover kind of go all in it together as well. I know you mentioned this that you're currently writing the third book. Is that the only thing that you're writing? Are you the type of writer who likes to only focus on one project at a time, or you write other stuff as well?
Usually I tend to focus on one project at a time. At the moment, I've actually got a couple going on. So as I've mentioned before, the first draft, well, I say it's the first draft, it's kind of maybe the second or third draft because I've gone back and fixed bits of it. But the current draft of third book is kind of sitting there. I'm taking a break from it so that I can go back with fresh eyes. I'm also currently working on a standalone novel as well, which is based on a character that I used for a short story as part of an anthology called Skybreaker. It's a completely different story. I've just taken the character out to that world and kind of reused them. But that I'm about a third of the way through at the moment, and I'm hoping that will be one that I can publish possibly next year. That is, again, it's a little bit later probably in setting than We Men is, because we're kind of getting into a period where there's motor cars and there's electricity. It's probably between like 1910 1920. And that probably, I do lean a little bit more into magic in this one. So it's been interesting for me to try and develop like more magical systems, because obviously We Men of Ash is a very kind of low fantasy. And then the third project that I'm working on at the moment, which is super top secret, so I can't mention too much, that's going to be a collaboration with several other indie authors. I'm really excited. We're not going to be able to talk about that for a few months yet because it's kind of early stages, but yeah, hopefully that one will be very exciting to work on.
Oh, well, you already got me excited with your solo project, with the third book and this super secret project. I can't wait to maybe when you all decide to, unravel the news, I'll be at the forefront of like shouting about it from the rooftop. So thank you so much for talking about that. You kind of preempted my next question because I was gonna ask you
Okay.
about that, because, with your current books being low fantasy, I was just wondering, like, if you, once you plan to finish the Vanguard Chronicles, do you have any plans to write other books? Because I always feel like, even though, like you mentioned, your books, I would say they're even lower than lower fantasy because there's only like very little magic with with Vanguard himself, and of course he discussed somebody else having a similar kind of magic. But it's almost like a world where magic is so rare that to find a person, another person like that is basically happenstance. Any chance you're planning? And I know you mentioned your the Skybreaker character bringing it, but besides that, do you have any plans to write in other subgenres of fantasy for the future? This doesn't have to be now, but maybe for the future.
I certainly would like to try and branch out. I think, I mean, talking kind of about the magic element of it, I'm really keen to explore different ways of presenting magic because as much as I love to read it, I don't like to write about magic where it is kind of the traditional casting magic
Mhm.
and if you have this power then you have to sacrifice this. I really like to explore almost, it's almost not magic, but I'd love to see more you know almost like superhero style fantasy,
Mhm.
so X-Men and that kind of thing, but in a fantasy world setting. So whether I'll be capable of writing that, I don't know, but I like the idea of trying that and seeing if you could kind of mesh those two things together.
No, that is all. That sounds awesome. Let me just tell you that definitely sounds awesome. I don't think I've read anything. The closest I've come to, with in superheroes in, I don't want to say fantasy, but like just contemporary fantasy is, the Peter Clines's X Hero series, and the premise is, this is not a spoiler. It's like imagine Avengers meets The Walking Dead, and it's funny,
Mhm.
and that's his premise. But that's the closest I've come to, like in superheroes and fantasy. So I would kind of love it if you would do that in the future. No pressure. As a
No
fan, I
pressure.
can no pressure. No, honestly, as a fan, like as a reader and a fan, I'm always wanting more from the writer, just because the writers that allow, it's like it's the dopamine fix if you want to get really physiological about it. The books that you write, give us enough amount of dopamines that we're like, oh, now we need more, now we need more. Which kind of brings me to my next question. How many books, besides the third book, how many books are you planning in the Vanguard Chronicles?
I mean, at the moment, that's one that I find hard to answer because initially I had planned to do 4 books,
Mhm.
and I have it the story plotted out. I mean, I've had the character arcs plotted out from the very beginning, so I know where they're going to end up. Um, as the story has evolved, as I've been writing it, certain things have changed. So now I'm still wavering about whether it's going to be a 3 book series or a 4 book series, because I do feel that there's definitely enough storyline and enough kind of for the characters to do for it to be 4. However, I think at the point of writing this third book, I now have to start bringing in some of the answers for people because, you as a writer, you ask the readers to be patient with you, but you'll obviously have to pay that off with
Mhm.
answers, with explanations. So whether it's going to be 3 books or 4 books, I don't know. What I am basically doing is I'm writing it to the finish of what would essentially be the 4th book, and then whether or not I split that out or not, I haven't quite decided yet.
Okay. Well, we will wait and find out when you decide, and let us know about that as well. Holly, lastly, before I let you go, what are you reading currently?
I think I mentioned it earlier, but I'm actually reading a lot of non-fiction at the moment. I'm reading a lot of historical biographies. So
Mhm.
I have Matilda at the moment, which is the biography of Empress Matilda. I mean, I talk about being a slow reader. I've flown through that in about a week. It's just, she's one of my favorite historical characters. She's fascinating. So yeah, I'm going through a bit of a old queens
Mhm.
and empresses phase at the moment. So I have Eleanor of Aquitaine I'm going to
Oh,
read
okay.
next. And I'm going to do a reread of She Wolves as well by Helen Castor.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Oh,
big historical kick at the moment.
some fascinating stuff, indeed. Holly, I want to thank you so much for your time today and for this fascinating discussion. I will be adding your links, but for our viewers, can you just tell where they can find you online if they wish to?
The best place to find me would usually be on Twitter, which is at Holly Tinsley, and the E in Tinsley is a 3. I'm usually on there 90% of the time. So if you do see me on there, tell me to get off Twitter and start writing.
Well, for our viewers, I'll be adding links to Holly's website, Holly's Twitter page. Also, I'll be adding links to both the fantasy book critic reviews of both of her books, Women of Ash and Shadow and The Hand That Cast the Bone. Holly Tinsley, thank you so very much again for your time and for talking about Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns. It has been a real pleasure, and hopefully I will get to interview you / bug you again when you release the 3rd book, because I definitely do want to talk to you more about that. Thanks again, Holly.
That would be amazing. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Okay.